Welcome back. We are going to start the second half of day 2 at Experimenter Curators Hub 2023. We are very grateful to all of you for being here, for joining us through the day, for all of those following online. It is a great pleasure to introduce artist and writer Shubigi Rao's practice. Many of you are familiar with her work. Her early work as well as ongoing work, her long-term commitments that include, since 2014, the project Pulp, a short biography of the banished book. Her works emerge as constellations, so they take place in the world in multidisciplinary approaches. They bring together collaborators, long-term dialogues, and emerge in the form of film, art, bookmaking, and photography. Her fields of study and interest include histories and lies, literature and violence, the history of the mind, I might add, but also libraries and archival systems as necessary systems of knowledge circulation, but also not systems of the finitude of knowledge, but rather its flows, its recursive potential. Shubigi has represented Singapore at the 59th Venice Biennale last year. She has won numerous accolades for her visual art and literary works, which include the Singapore Literature Prize and the APB's Signature Art Prize. She has very recently just been in conversation with Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak. Her commitments in that sense also include being in these journeys of dialogue with public intellectuals. And this is, again, where we appreciate the breadth of Shubigi's practice and see her in this purview joining us today. Most recently, she has also been the curator of the Las Kochi Maziris Biennale. As an artist, she has an upcoming major solo exhibition at the Rockbund Art Museum in Shanghai. Welcome.
Am I audible? Okay. I can hear my voice echoing back at me, which is a good sign. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for inviting me, Pratik and Priyanka. Soft spot for ECH. I was here in 2019 when I was doing curatorial research for the Kochi Maziris Biennale, which is actually the main subject of my talk today. I know, Natasha, we had wanted to also discuss my practice, but this also relates to my practice. And I know this looks like a really conventional slide, title of Biennale, dates, and so on. But the title actually came from a drawing I did. And you know how you should always, I really tried to look at other people's poetry and other people's drawings, but I felt almost like I would be appropriating or co-opting the words of others when I should take ownership and responsibility for what it meant to helm a visual arts festival as large as this. And so I decided to use one of my own drawings, and it's okay if you can't read the words because it doesn't really matter. But this is a drawing that accompanied the second volume from my Pulp project. And it's also the first volume where I very clearly foregrounded the voices of people who were completely overlooked in the media, people who had survived conflict and war. And it was about their resilience 35 years after the siege, and this is, we're talking about the Balkans. And also what it meant to be survivors in the margins, but also people who thrived. And this is something you don't hear very often. When we speak of marginalization or the margins, we often speak from a position of extreme privilege, of course, that's one. But more importantly, we assume that to be in the margins is always a struggle. Whereas the margins are where the conversations and strategies for survival actually are, at least to my mind, ones that we should be listening to. So that's one of the things I had very clearly for this Biennale. A lot of people assume that the fire and ink, these words were what they should look at. But what I was really looking at was the act of veining. What it means when things flow, how do stories spread, how do dangerous ideas spread. All of this was of course implicated in this notion. So this is actually a list of the artists and collectives. Actually, you can look at this online, so I'm not going to leave this up here for too long. I know a lot of people didn't get to see the exhibition, for which I really am very sorry, because it was, and this is actually going to be the main thrust of this talk really. This Biennale was supposed to open in 2020. Because of the pandemic, it had to be postponed twice. And then it was postponed also on the eve of its actual opening, which was supposedly the 12th of December. So I sometimes half-jokingly call it the perpetually postponed Biennale. But I also think I want to speak about, thank you for one person who found that amusing, because it wasn't amusing at the time. And I like to believe that adventures like this can make for funny anecdotes later, but sometimes there's still a lot of discussion that should be had. And I think one of the main thrusts, again, of this talk today, 30-minute talk, is for me to imagine what it's like if we could all just consider what the pandemic really did to us. What it really did, amongst all the other things that we've heard, is that it actually was a warning sign. It's the first of many ruptures. And we still haven't learned anything. So I think as far as I'm concerned, this was a warning sign that actually went completely ignored. What do I mean by that? When we think of the pandemic, we think of it as an outlier incident, right? It's something that came out of nowhere, the world screeched to a halt, but really it didn't. What happened during the pandemic was the largest transfer of wealth from the world's population into the hands of the very few, right? The inequities that existed before the before the pandemic, oops, Freudian slip. Yeah, I know. I love how that slipped out. Yeah, I don't even remember the thought I was holding. Yes, so I totally blame my sleep deprivation and lack of nutrition at the moment. So I apologize because I'm actually running a little unwell. But where was I? What was I saying? Someone remind me. Transfer power. Yes, thank you. See how easy it is to distract us whenever we're talking about inequity. It's very easily distracted. So I think that, and I can describe it in this way. Sorry, I'm going to read from the curatorial statement, not the whole thing. Again, available online unless it's been taken down. But have a look if you wish. It's just a long screed, but. During the pandemic, I thought, I should revisit my curatorial note, right? Turned out I didn't need to change a thing because all the issues that were outlined there were as valid, if not more. And that's what I mean by the pandemic being a warning sign. It didn't actually come out of nowhere. We were heading for this sort of collapse, this sort of global rupture. And what I want to actually position here is, I'm primarily an artist, yes, and a writer and all those other things that you so very kindly mentioned, Natasha. But when you curate something as large as this Biennale, you think differently. You think not only about what the act of curating means, but the act of sustained support. That's what I want to really talk about. How is it over a 4-year period? How could you sustain over 90 artists' practices, right? And I'll go into that in a little more detail in a moment. Also, the communities that are involved in the staging of a Biennale as large as this, and one that it's such an important Biennale. We know this. We know how many communities are involved. We know what it means that it's held in Kochi. It's that in the position of Kerala vis-a-vis the central government, the freedoms that you can enjoy by having a Biennale in Kochi. We know what's riding here, right? But why is it that sustained support, rather how can we have that kind of sustained support in those sustained enduring conversations? I think for me, I thought of the Biennale as in many different ways, but I think the primary thing was this. It can be so much more than a mere accumulation of coincidental collisions. It can be a bulwark against despair. I'm paraphrasing because I can't bear to read my own words. And the Biennale as commons may seem like an impossible idea. And I know the commons is a very overused word, but just think of the commons as actual physical space. Then the Biennale, you begin to think of it as territory. Right? And I think it is brilliant for artists, workers, and people like that, just people who are involved in it, to think of it as their territory. There's already this very strong sense of it's our Biennale. That's kind of the slogan that goes with it, right? How about we see that in action? What does it mean for people to actually have that strong sense of ownership, for the commons to really be the commons, and not just something that's a top-down approach? I'm sorry if this is very idealistic, but I truly believe that for an ideal to exist, you must act as if it already does. And that's my philosophy. So I wanted to envision this Biennale really as a place where we refuse to be disillusioned, we refuse to disavow our poetry, our languages, our art, our music, our optimism, and our humor. Because ultimately our enemies are apathy and despair and cynicism. And that's what you don't give into. So sustaining this Biennale over a 4-year period was hard, to say the least. You lose a lot of momentum. All the artists that were, whose works, and we had a lot of new commissions actually, works were going to be done on site. It was extremely exciting. I was an artist, by the way, in the previous edition, and I made my film on site. I was there for 7 weeks, and I shot a film from start to finish in Kochi. And I mean, and there was an installation. Everything was done. All production was done completely on site, and I was able to do that because that's the nature of Kochi. And I was really excited as a curator to make opportunities for artists to do the same. When the pandemic hit, one of the things that happened is production was no longer possible. People couldn't fly in. That's the obvious, right? But also, what happened was businesses, small businesses closed. People who could fabricate no longer existed. Their businesses just folded up. People couldn't sustain their livelihoods, right? A lot of artisan and craftspeople moved out. And this is also something that doesn't get talked about enough. It became visible to me and to the artists because we just couldn't find people. My curatorial team couldn't locate people on site anymore to carry out so many of the collaborative proposals we had envisioned. So one by one, I watched and saw how a lot of the things that I had idealistically hoped would happen, and you should be idealistic as a curator, I think, right? They just were no longer possible. We now hit, so the first postponement happened to November 2021, right? And I think at that point there was a discussion with the institution, the Kochi Biennale Foundation. They were, I think, keen on having kind of hybrid version, very similar to what Nirin did, I think, the Sydney Biennale, where part of it, because I was there when lockdown was instituted and suddenly Nirin had to close down. This is March 2020. And then the exhibition moved online, got massive number of footfalls, so to speak, and so it proved that the online exhibition could work. But now we're talking November 2021. This is a year later. People have digital fatigue. Despite that, the discussion was, okay, domestic travelers can still come into Kochi, but we can't get international travelers in. How about we have a semi-physical exhibition for, I remember this discussion about having a hybrid exhibition, semi-online, semi-physical. And the online component meant a number of artists who were going to do production on site, who were going to work with local material, local people, and so on, were now unable to do so, and therefore decided to switch to digital forms. It meant that if any of you saw the exhibition, you'll know there was a preponderance of AV works. This is why. Because we had no choice. We really actually, and the artists themselves chose to migrate online. If you recall, there was also massive pressure from a number of artists couldn't, their studio shut down, they couldn't work on location, all of that happened. I know, since I'm from Singapore, the National Arts Council switched its funding guidelines to favor digital and online or virtual artworks. So this is just one country I'm talking about. So I know that artists who had migrated to online media were now getting larger support. And a lot of our support had dried up because all the funds we had raised or the grants we had gotten for the first run were no longer, couldn't be ported over to a new financial year. So these are the actual mechanics of a biennale that never get talked about, but I think should be also thought about. How do you sustain support? That also includes financial support, right? So a number of artists who were able to get grants from in their own countries, now that didn't work anymore. So unless they move to online media. And what does that mean? And there are the problems with that as well. Let me just look at it again at the, yes. Our commingled virtual futures are inextricable from the transmission of knowledge, ideas, and capital, and so we are subject to neoliberal infiltration and control. What this really means is the more we have an online, the more we exist online, the more we exist in a digital way, in a digital form, the more we are subject to surveillance and control. And this was something that I spoke about with a number of artists like Gabriela Lofel, for instance, who maybe we can speak about later in the conversation, Natasha, if you wish, okay? Because I think that was an important part of the flow. And her work talks about exactly this, who owns what is a tax haven, and so on. These are all things that we don't talk about in I think in the scope of an exhibition so much, because I think, but so how to say, the murky money of the art world has to be implicated. And I really wanted to do that with this exhibition as well. But all to say, by the time we actually came around, so then the hybrid exhibition idea was also abandoned because finally the world was opening up. We eventually opened on, I can't even remember the date now. Was it the 26th or the 23rd of December? 10 days later, 10 days after the 12th, I think. So the 23rd of December, I think it was, or 22nd, almost just before Christmas. And when we opened, one of the things that happened when I was on site there for the installation was a beautiful realization of song. The reason I put strategy here is because throughout, and even in my curatorial note, I talk about storytelling as strategy. What are the ways in which, the strategies in which we can share, we can, and I don't mean sharing story only, I mean we're all subject to the same, but to varying degrees, we're all subject to different forms of, how do you say, I mean it's all there in my notes, but I don't remember offhand, but we're just all subject to similar kind of pressures and forms of control. We are subject to similar, I mean a lot of the countries we're from, all of us have demagogues in charge. We live in politically charged environments where we don't acknowledge the nature of that political charge, let's put it this way. And as I read online during the pandemic, which is a really perfect way to put it, we're all in the same storm, but we're not in the same boat. And I really love that because that is so important to acknowledge. There's massive class struggles also involved. Like I said, the major transfer of wealth that happened, it was no coincidence that happened. There's a reason that this is known as disaster capitalism, for instance, right? So part of the thing that I was looking for was looking at artists when I was doing the curatorial research. Artists who are regionally they're very aware of the environment in which they live and work. How do they translate that environment, and really importantly, how their translation through their work is also universally resonant. And that is so incredibly powerful to me. That is the simplest way to discuss strategy sharing, sorry. So I always thought of it as story being literary minded, right? Which was very narrow of me, I now realize, because actually song worked effectively. The first thing you saw when you entered the Biennale, for those of you who didn't go, I'm going to do just really quick. I'm not running through the Biennale. This is not a tour of it, okay? I'm not capable of doing that because I think in 30 minutes, just not possible. But the first thing you saw at Aspinwall House, for instance, was actually Haegu Young's work. And it was a really simple work in terms of, it resonated with people, no pun intended, because it's bells. But I think that this was also important because you need to break down that first barrier that exists when you enter an exhibition of this scale and of this nature, which is the barrier of you look at it, or you're looking at the image of something, or you have to comprehend it. None of that was required here. You just touched it, you played with it, or you watched other people touch and play with it. That's it. This really, I'm not doing Haegu a disservice here, but I just want to say this was a tactile work. Okay, and that was the reason, that was the first thing you saw. As you went through, I'm not again not a tour, so we've gone to a wholly different part of Aspinwall. But I also think this is what I mean when I talk about song as strategy. This is one of the best examples. I knew I wanted this work. I think within a day of agreeing to curate this Biennale, I knew I wanted this work. It's not a new work, it's not a new commission, but that to me is not important. This is a work done by a collective of two people, Ishwar and Anushka. This is they call themselves Uramili. And this is an absolutely brilliant work. If you haven't seen it, it's an incredible film. It did the whole festival circuit. It's highly celebrated actually, and deservedly so. If you haven't seen it, let me know. I'll find a way to get a link to you. But the thing about it is also because I sort of, correct me if I'm wrong, but I kind of feel that the northeast states of India aren't always factored into conversations as much as they should. I'm being very polite here and very politic because I'm no longer an Indian citizen, but I just also have to say that that I am very acutely aware of this lacuna that has been there ever since I grew up very close to those areas as well, but even then I know that this is something that I wanted to address. So I think that the idea of, as you can see, it's all written here, so I'm not going to read this out. Am I blocking it? Yeah, you can read it? Okay, super. I think it's really important to sort of, to actually also acknowledge that sometimes what can't be said, because you'll see this in other work I'm going to show you as well, it can be sung. And what can be sung are not only desires and songs of land, but also, it also talks about what it means to be a people that regularly face oppression. What it means to celebrate while acknowledging your marginal status. And this power of song I don't want to, how do I say, I don't want to over-explicate or over-explain this, but it's an incredibly powerful film, and it's also because it's very direct in what it's trying to do. It's less of an art film and more of a film of celebration, I think, more than anything else. And this is another example, of course. Tao does really incredible work. I don't know if you've seen her. So this is an example of also what I wanted to mention by enduring relationships. So some of the new commissions that we had were by artists like Ali Sherry and Tao as well. Because we postponed their works, they both were invited to the Venice Biennale in the main exhibition. Both asked, like, is it okay if we show the work we've been working on? I said, of course, go ahead. So for me, it was not important that just because we were supposed to show the work first, we must show the work first. I really don't care about that. That's quite meaningless to me, that kind of idea that, you're showcasing this brand new work by this artist. I think it was much more important to recognize that artists actually didn't have the resources they normally do during the pandemic. It would have been very unreasonable for me to expect them to make something brand new when resources just weren't available, nor were they able to go and work on location. Ali in particular was working in South Sudan. It wouldn't have been possible for him to travel elsewhere during that time, or even travel there. So same with Tao. And I think this is also because for Tao, this is a work that was part of a larger, her Becoming Alluvium series, which is incredibly beautiful. I hope you saw her work at Venice. That's the same film. And I'm really happy she got to show it at Venice as well. Her work really deserves to be seen by many. She also did a series of really beautiful paintings. I put this wall of text up here so I don't have to explain it, because I always feel it's important to also read what the artist, they're sort of their own words really, so to speak. I wanted to talk about this work again, because when I mentioned about song as strategy, this is a great exemplar of that. This is a work by an artist called Mata Tuomala, who's Finnish. Finland, like many countries, has flirted with and also embraced far-right ideology. This work was made in it's a 45-minute cycling video, stationary bike video, workout video, or so it seems. 45 minutes is the exact length of time that a far-right politician took to preach austerity to the nation, while also being accused of embezzling money through shady real estate deals. Okay, so she uses his words. She has anarchic rap. There's all manner of things perhaps not suitable for children in this video, where she cycles continuously for that duration of time, and it's really an endurance performance to show, because part of the speech by this politician was also about how artists are a drain on society. Artists don't work hard, they don't work at all actually, and they don't do anything to contribute and so on. And this was her contribution. She says, I'm working hard, this is my workout, this is what, and you can join me. We can all join together for the glory of Finland. It was brilliant. It was a takedown of jingoism, nationalism, patriotism, all of it in one. And this whole austerity, all these austerity measures that Europe instituted, that really again was a wealth transfer and a cutting of social security, removal of social safety nets. So this was a work, again, regionally specific but globally applicable. Why? Because austerity measures are now adopted all over the world. Any regime that wants to transfer wealth from people, especially working class people, that's what they do. Mata's actually working class. Her other works I highly recommend also, because she's done works where she worked as a cleaner to put herself through art school, by the way. And her films about cleaners are incredible. It's just brilliant. Again, an example of how you thrive and celebrate the margins without actually only speaking about the margins in terms of in an abject way. And then camp. I don't know if anyone's seen this work as well. So the sounds from all these works, and all of them use song to some degree or the other. Song, to a great extent, speaks of politics. It speaks of just the very human desire to vocalize. Sometimes the words aren't important, and sometimes they are, as in the case with camp. Amol's work also, Amol Patil's work, I think is an example of that. I think that as you walked around the Biennale, especially around Aspinwall, it really was quite lovely to hear everything before you actually walked in. That you experienced the work almost like a rumor before you entered the room. I think that was incredibly beautiful, because for 4 years that's all we had. We had nothing going out. There was really nothing visible, nothing audible. There was no communication. By the way, that's another hallmark of this Biennale. But I think that this was, to me, very, very powerful, that there was song. And song, like I said, could be lyrical. Song could also sometimes be just silence. And we saw that, for instance, in the way some of the collectives that were invited dissolved. Tuma was a collective from Myanmar of women photographers. For me, as someone who works with film and photography, I'm very acutely aware of gatekeeping. Also as a writer, I'm aware of gatekeeping. As an academic, I'm aware of gatekeeping. As an artist, I'm aware of gatekeeping. As a curator, I'm aware of gatekeeping. What am I talking about? Well, the usual forms of gatekeeping that occur, one of the most obvious ones being sexism. We all know that more technically oriented media has for a long time shut out women. And people who don't, we know this about photography and film in particular. And of course, with technology being the way it is, with the DSLR and mirrorless technology, it is now possible to actually break through that barrier. So technology has been an incredible form of release. You don't need a crew now to make a film if you don't wish. The rise of the solo women filmmaker has been talked about a lot. But I think it was really important to also highlight photographers and a collective of women photographers. Because, I don't know if you know this, but there was a coup, military coup in Myanmar. This collective fell apart. I won't go into the whole why of it, but that's what tends to happen with regime. Like I said, we live in politically charged environments all the time. We're sometimes just not aware of how charged that political environment is till it actually comes and bumps up against us. So Rita Kind is one of the collective. Of the collective of 4, eventually 3 were able to make it for the Biennale. I think one just stopped practicing. Rita was one of them, and this is what I mean by silence. It's an incredibly calm-looking series of work that actually speak of the takeover of land. They speak of violence. They speak of complete erasure and absence of the voice of the people. Really very, again, these are Rita's words at the bottom. This is an example. In fact, this is when I remember the first announcement went out. This was the image that was chosen. I remember. And a lot of people were like, yeah, but it's such a, sort of powerful, punchy image. And it's like, we don't need a powerful, punchy image. This is powerful in its own way. And I think it's really nice that you need to look at it to really see what's being said here. And then you have artists like Ximena, Garrido, Leka, who also, this is really interesting work. I really love the way so many artists globally have been looking at the pre-colonial in a way as if colonization didn't exist. It's a way of erasing the colonial narrative. And it's very interesting in places where post-colonial theory is not de rigueur, where it's not the norm where you don't use post-colonial theory to figure out or to work out the damage of the colonial, of imperialism. And I've seen this a lot in Southeast Asia as well, and I think it's really brilliant. A lot of performance artists do this. They look at pre-colonial forms of movement, and it's not merely replicated, it's reimagined and invigorated in a completely, it's really quite different way of thinking of performance. It's as if the colonization of the body didn't occur. And it's not a denial that it didn't occur. We know it occurred. We see the signs of colonialism around us all the time, everywhere. I mean, I'm from Singapore. We celebrated 200 years of being colonized. It was called the Bicentennial of Singapore. Yeah, the only statue of a man you'll see floating around Singapore, well, not floating, but you know what I mean, is Sir Stamford Raffles, genocidal colonizer. So, well, what can I say? But you also see people. So like I said, you don't have to constantly grapple with the enemy. You don't have to constantly fight your oppressor head on. That is one strategy. But I'm a great believer also in other forms. Ignoring. Just pretend it doesn't exist. And what would you do in the absence of that monolith? What would you do in the absence of that powerful force that has kind of dominated your entire life, your grandparents and your ancestors' lives, How do you, there's one way also to discuss, I think, and to think about how transgenerational trauma can also be addressed through this form of thinking. You're remembering the voices of your foremothers and your forefathers without thinking of the dispossession and violence that is the colonial action, right? And instead, your actions and your movements and your gestures are informed by the pre-colonial. This is an excellent example. The act of weaving electrical wire sounds like a really simple artifice. And it sounds like an artifice, right? Powered by solar cables that then read out these codes. It can sound almost like a gimmick, but it's really not. And it's simply because for Ximena, she's very strategic about how she does this and why. And it's also a remembrance of because as we know, textile is political, as I'm sure you will hear very soon after me. I think that it's also one of the, there's a reason why it's one of the indigenous forms of understanding of textile weaving and all have been targeted by the colonial. But let's also look at another factor. Domestic knowledge is one of the most disregarded forms of knowledge. I know you said I talk about libraries and archives, right? But I think of them as places of exclusion. I think of them as when I look at a library, beautiful, humble, it doesn't matter. I always think of what's not there, whose voices didn't make it in, and what forms of knowledge do we constantly disregard. And because I work so much with people who survived genocide, like my new film is in Armenia, for instance, there's an ongoing genocide, no one's talking about it. But every time I talk to people, one of their forms of survival is, and this is when they've lost family members, they've lost everything, lost land, etc. They try and save only two things, their children and their culture. Because that's all you have. And culture can be your books, your manuscripts, but it can also be remembering how to weave lace, remembering how to sew, how to make, how to craft things as an act of care within the family. So-called domestic knowledge, which is very heavily feminized, is often also disregarded. And this was it was important for me to have that also present as a form of storytelling. This is, yeah, it was really special to be able to show this work. I find it very hard to actually talk about Madia's work. I think partly because I think it's also because of her eye. It's the way she filmed, the way she, I sort of feel this, how do I say it? I hope you'll forgive me if I say that I felt a kind of sisterhood. A very strong one, which I don't usually feel because I work in isolation quite a bit. I have to work alone because of the projects that I work on. But her films in particular, as you can see, it's hard from, it's just very incredibly moving. Again, would highly recommend you look up her work if you, I like the way I'm kind of trying to encourage you all to look up stuff because that's what you should actually do, not rely on one person talking. And speaking of the non-verbal, Gabriel Goliath's brilliant, wonderful work. This is the work that I was really keen on showing, called Chorus. I think this work was important also to show, given the high levels of violence in this country as well, against women and queer folk. And this is, did anyone see the exhibition at all? I'm so reluctant to describe the work. Thank you. 2 people, yay, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yeah, okay, yay, thank you. Super. So if you, of course you did. I remember I met you there also. So if you remember, before you climb up, right, to the top floor, you can hear this work, which is right at the end actually. You can hear this work before you reach there. And it was really important to have this work audible for a long time before you actually physically access it. And that you're listening to this hum. And what it really is it's an elegy, it's a lament. For 20 minutes, the choir just makes a humming sound. Now, as you know, when you sing, you can sing from here. But when you hum from within your body. A hum is a vibration, it's a frequency. It's not a word. There's no word. There are no words for this, for what this work is about. And on the wall facing across from this was just the names and the dates of death of all the people who were murdered, all the women and non-binary folks who were murdered, who were victims of sexual and gender-based violence in South Africa. I thought this was a work that was very necessary to show for obvious reasons, but I think it was also important for us to consider that sometimes you don't need to explicate, like I'm unfortunately doing right now. That's why I asked if you had seen it. If more of you had seen it, I wouldn't have explained this work at all, because you'd know exactly what I meant when I said that that silence can be very powerful, the wordless can be powerful, the non-verbal can be powerful. We don't always need words. This is actually a work that I have a kind of slight bias when it comes to this work. I think I was in my late teens or early 20s, or late teens probably, when my mother told me about the Ogoni 9. I'm sure you all know about the Ogoni 9? No. Okay, so Shell oil company basically there was oil in the Niger Delta, and because a number of environmental activists and local grassroots people, basically local people, were protesting against what Shell was doing to their land and the massive pollution, also the appropriation of land in collaboration with the government. 9 of them were arrested on trumped up charges and executed. Their leader was a man called Ken Saro-Wiwa. And I remember the first time when I heard this story, it was from my mother. And that's why also I love listening to Jacinta talk about her mother, because I think it's so important we listen to our mothers when they talk about the stories that affect them, the things that matter to them. And I remember my mother being so angry about this, the deliberate, just the way the way that Shell and the government of Nigeria could execute people on trumped up charges, and there was mild outrage globally and then everyone forgot about it. I don't know if you know this, but during the pandemic years, it saw the highest number of extrajudicial killings of environmental activists globally. So this was unfortunately always topical. I had invited Zina before the pandemic, but again very, very topical. This is a work again that's looks celebratory, but it really isn't. These masks, which are traditional, are not traditional. They're not hand carved. They're actually made from the same petroleum byproducts that were responsible for the murder of her father. Ruchika Negi and Amit Mahanti. Also, I think this is a work that's really. I actually grew up near the Teesta River, so I remember when the damming occurred, and we were talking about this as well. I'm sorry, can you read this clearly? I'm not sure. Yes. Yeah? Okay, brilliant. Okay, super. Yeah, I can't tell because I'm really close to it, so I can. But again, as we know, one of the biggest, and this was a preoccupation with me, I mentioned in my curatorial note as well, the question of land. Land is not only terrain, land is everything, it's metaphor, we tie so much to land. And one of the major reasons why land co-opting happens is not only real estate, oil and mining interests, but also hydroelectricity. So the so-called green energy, and we've seen this also right now in Sami lands being taken over for wind farms. And you know, if you stand in the way of that, you're against, you know, a kind of green solution to climate change. It's very cynical, the whole thing. But hydroelectricity was touted in the 80s and 90s, especially even earlier, I think in the 70s, as a green solution to the energy problems. But what is an energy problem? It means urban consumption. Urban consumption of energy depends on rural and non-urban land being destroyed, terrain being destroyed, people's communities being destroyed, and also environments being destroyed. So this work was again very important because the big dams are a big problem, not just in India, but in other nations as well. It's seen as a way to fast-track development when it really actually isn't. It's feeding a monster that's never satisfied, and that's our demand for energy. This was a very powerful work again, and this was in the so-called laboratory area of Aspinwall, which is a notoriously hard area to work with apparently, but I thought this was brilliant. And I really like this work as well, and I put it here because it speaks in different ways. And when I say silence is what I mean. What happens in the Northeast stays in the Northeast. It's like the rest of India just, you know what I'm talking about, right? Yeah, okay, thanks. I'm almost done anyway, thanks. So these are some of the other works as well to explain what I mean by different forms of storytelling as strategy. I was really happy that I got to see the work of Vasudevan Akitam in particular, thanks to Mario, who was on my curatorial team. I think it was really important, and this is one of the things I care a lot about. I wanted to look at people who'd spent their lives educating, right? And therefore sometimes their careers didn't get as much attention, or they didn't get as many opportunities, but they were responsible actually for teaching or training generations of artists, right, in university. And we don't actually get to hear that very often. And I thought it would be interesting to actually show that. This work in particular at the bottom by Vasudevan Akitam is actually one, it's called Almanac of a Lost Year, one drawing for every day of the pandemic. The one on top is Richard Bell's Embassy, very famous. It's a different version, of course. He makes sure that different versions in each place that it's shown. Trevor Marlong's brilliant, powerful woodcuts and prints. Again, so I'm just doing a quick run through. It's not actually how I like to talk about the Biennale. I wish always to I don't like to show some artists over others. I'm doing it this time because I'm aware a lot of people didn't see the exhibition, and this is the first time I'm speaking about the Biennale in India. So I really want you to know the sort of the artists, just a few of the artists at least. So hopefully you'll go online and look for more, or ask me. So one of the things I really enjoyed about the Biennale also the kind of people who it speaks to, the people who've been coming for every edition. And when we speak about localness, we can be very essentialist, and you have to be really careful when you speak about localness. But I think that the Kochi Museris Biennale to me is really its audience in many ways. I absolutely love that. I love that it's a celebration of different practices within a particular regional specificity, and that the works travel so well. Yeah. These are the photos from my phone. By the most of these I think are from my phone. I don't remember if this one is, but it was just, you know, I'd like to stand around sometimes semi-anonymously and take photos of people looking at the work. That was really lovely. This is Basma Al-Sharif. The previous one was Ali Sherry's work. This is Basma Al-Sharif's room, reading room, with a very profane text that luckily no one realizes. Very profane and no complaints. So it was nice to have all these people reading a very, very erotic text. Yeah, this is Zana Kadirova's work. Oh God, I'd loved her work for years, and I was so excited I finally got to invite her. I know, and time is almost up. Just really quickly, she did this brilliant work many years ago, which she doesn't do anymore, where she makes clothes out of, you know, bathroom tiles. In abandoned, like in places like that, she'll take the tiles and then make the work and hang it. It's really amazing. This is a brilliant work of hers. It's from a river in Kiev where she's from. She's Ukrainian, and it looks like loaves of bread, but it's actually river stones cut to look like loaves of bread. And the word for it, when said with a Ukrainian accent, means hospitality. But a Russian accent, if you're Russian, you can't pronounce it the same way. And it was one of the ways in which Ukrainians could figure out whether the person speaking to them was Russian. So it's a very powerful work. Yeah, I'm sorry I'm out of time. I really wanted to speak more about these works. I think that this was, anyway, I think Jacinta also spoke already about Ishan's work. But yeah, I think I'll just end here. I hope that perhaps I can explore some other threads in our conversation, but thank you so much for your attention. I apologize if I'm not fully in focus. I'm slightly unwell, so just thank you for your attention.
I personally want to express, I personally want to express immense gratitude, Shubigi, for taking the effort and creating this thread for us to experience in this room. I, as a curator, not talking as ECH right now, but as a curator who has labored for biennials in different parts of the world and has also co-curated and directed a biennial during pandemic in South Korea with a brilliant sister, Daphne Ayas, the Gwangju Biennial. I do not take it lightly at all, the effort that you and others have made to generate the last edition. And I continue to think that if we want such brilliant artist curators to do this exercise and to perform this labor, we owe them, ourselves, volunteers, producers, artists who participate, to do better. I'm going to end. Don't want to rant, but I want to say that. Thank you so much. Thank you. So I think what became visible really through song and strategy and the kinds of forms of storytelling that you shared with us, I think for me finally made certain constellations also more apparent, where I realized that in this edition there was, for me personally, a more complex kind of thinking around, say, a practitioner who has been in this biennial model before, like say Amar Kanwar, whose work is very present, but then he is next to the work, his work is seen next to, say, Basma. And that changes how one reads an artist like Amar, who everybody thinks they know already and have seen in sufficiently and in large scale in such models. And I felt that these sort of insertions that were made, these conversations that were made, the intimacies that were produced between artists was something that was, I don't know, somehow also marked, like you said, this unbracketed spiraling time of inequities and infrastructural breakdowns. And yeah, I wonder if, I don't know, like there's also so many works now that are actually circulating in the world, which is fantastic. So even if audiences couldn't see them in Kochi, there's work of Seher Shah, for instance, which was at Pepper House, that is now in Taiwan. And I think again, this is a form of sustainability and the kind of relays that happen across curatorial kinships and dialogues, right? Where artists' works continue to be annotated and remixed in different situations of biennial making. So I wonder if we could, speak to that a little bit more as well.
Thank you for bringing that up, and thank you for mentioning Seher, whose work was extraordinary. I mean, it was brilliant and so perfectly positioned, I thought, in Pepper House. I'm so happy that this work is traveling as well, topical and sadly always topical as always. I also want to mention another work in Pepper House, P.O. Bad's work. P.O. from the Philippines. P.O.'s work, this was really important to show also, because P.O. made this work over many years. And he also showed alongside another artist whose work had been made over 7 years. When I talked about the pandemic and the disruption and the Biennale taking 4 years, right? It's important to remember that artist productions and a thought that they take to its logical conclusion takes time. How do you come in the middle of a process and then demand to show a part of the process? So I really love it when works travel, and I actually always encourage artists when they reshow a work to reinvent it. It is totally okay to change it up. You don't have to replicate it exactly, and I think a lot of artists do that anyway. I think that's kind of the joy, and I'm sure as curators you encourage that as well, right? And that's so important because sight matters. And like with P.O.'s work, for instance, time mattered. Actually, every work in Pepper House was a time-sensitive work or a work of holding breath. There was a very specific quality to all the works there, right? P.O.'s work was important because you all know the Marcos family and the atrocities they committed in the Philippines, right? Well, guess what? The election happened, and guess who was voted back in power? Another member of the Marcos family. It's almost like this amnesia was only one generation old, and that's it. And it's not only the Philippines, it's everywhere. I mean, look at the Netherlands right now. I mean, it's so sad that every time I've given a talk, I think in the last few years, I can just at this moment say, look at what's happening right now in this country. Because at any given time, there's a new alt-right asshole who's come up. I'm sorry for the language, but really, it's just this rise of far-right ideology that's just so vile. So I'm really happy that some of these works travel, because these issues don't vanish overnight. When you make a work about something as important as these artists have done, it's really important it be seen in a lot of places. And it does have an effect. I know an extraordinary number of people visited the Kochi Biennale this time, and I'm glad they did, because I also think about, like I showed you some audience photos, yes, but a lot of people who visit are also international art world people, right? Which is why, to come to your question of how these proximities work, I thought through very clearly about what I wanted to say about certain things. So the darkest, most dismal part of Aspinwall, there is a dark, dismal part. You know what I'm talking about. It's where all the works about climate change or the Earth were, the future of the planet, because that's the future of our planet. We can say what we like, but it's doomed. And so all the works were you had Cecilia Vicuña, you had forensic architecture talking about gold mining in the Amazon, you had Uriel Olo's along the entire long corridor, you had a timeline of climate change in color, like each color representing the shift in global temperatures. And you had Susan Shipley with work about the glaciers in the Himalayas and the Swiss Alps. You had all these works, but bang in the middle, you had one work by Gabriela Lofel, which was about free ports. And a lot of people were like, what's this work doing here? I didn't want to say it out loud. I was hoping, you know, I like things that bug you, that don't make sense, because then hopefully your brain will take that extra effort to figure things out. If it's spoon fed to you, it's just you're going to forget about it in no time, because that's how we consume information. But the reason it's there is because what sits in free ports. A free port, by the way, for those of you who don't know, is a tax haven. It's very often slightly offshore. Singapore has one, Geneva has one, there's one in China. There's, I mean, well, just naming these countries, you should already guess what's in there. These are tax havens. It's where the rich people of the world, including the art world, park their ill-gotten wealth in the form of art, amongst other things. There's a reason that the art world features as an entire chapter in the Panama Papers. And I wanted bang in the middle of all these people walking smugly past, oh yeah, you know, it's good to see these works about climate change, talking about our planet, while at the same time not divesting themselves or calling out where all the money was coming from. It's coming from the oil lobby, it's coming from the mining lobby, it's coming from people who profit off the planet and off other people, and then they park their money in art and they look at what they can collect. And I wanted this work bang in the middle. I wanted this work about the free port to actually talk about just that, because the profit that's made in the art world goes into very specific pockets. That's just one example.
And maybe just going to the title again,
yeah.
Because you began with the drawing, and the drawing itself is this ensemble of ideas, of sensations.
Yeah.
It carries a certain kind of restless energy in itself, and I wanted to sort of go back to the title, also because Cecilia Vicunia's work again is something that we have a shared affinity towards, and really thinking about ink and fire also through this quote. Which is an old quote around censorship. The paper burns, but words fly away.
Yeah.
And that carries both ink and fire in it as well.
Yes.
And with Cecilia Vicuña, but many other artists, I started to think as well about the reinvention of language.
Yeah.
The way that artists also, like you said, ignoring is a strategy, but sometimes. Speaking in tongues is a strategy.
Yes.
So that one is also based between language in order to be purposefully opaque to translation of a certain kind. I wonder if you'd like to speak to those strategies as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sorry.
Sure. Thank you. So, because in case the mic didn't pick it up for everyone, you're talking about things that defy translation and therefore defy scrutiny. That's a brilliant strategy. I'm a great lover of covert strategy. I think overt activism is essential. You need to take to the streets, for sure. It's a given, you need to do it. And I used to be a pacifist. I think that was a very smug position. I think it's very important to acknowledge that violence is the right of oppressed people. And I think it's important to put that in front. But one form of violence that's enacted upon people that are oppressed is through language. Language is the oppressor, or the tool of the oppressor very often. So one of the reasons why I love gaps in language and comprehension, I know a lot of people want this form of perfect communication, for things to be very clear, always at all times. I really think that's terrifying. That to me is the totalitarian. I love that we have failures in comprehension, that we don't fully always understand what we're reading or listening to. And I think that's why we have art and music and poetry, because all of that fills in the gaps, right? And that's why we have such a wealth and a diversity of expression across our species. By the way, not only our species, other species as well, I have to say. But I think that's really a very cogent strategy that we've seen enacted multiple times. That's the way you evade censorship in China, for instance. Winnie the Pooh, if you know what I'm talking about. If you don't know, look it up. It's like I'm giving out Google assignments here, I'm so sorry. But really, you should just, I love it when people discover stuff for themselves, because then you go down a rabbit hole. But just Winnie the Pooh and China, if you're wondering what the connection is, a brilliant way to evade censorship again. But like you mentioned, speaking about Cecilia Vicuña, of course, but even, I was so happy that we were able to have a poem of hers on the wall, for instance, next to her film. I think, and I'm also so grateful to be able to have listened to Jacinta's talk, for instance, and listen to her poems, because I feel poetry is really one of the most powerful things, because it doesn't explain. Because it's not a screed, it's not a thesis, right? My problem as a non-fiction writer is primarily it's a screed, and that's also okay. It's good to have angry screed. It's very, very important. Rage is very, very powerful. But as I mentioned right at the beginning in my curatorial note, humor and satire are very, very powerful. One of the ways that you can, I think, retain power or regain power is to mock the powerful. And the most effective forms of mockery are those where the joke is not understood by the totalitarian mind. Because ultimately the totalitarian mind is one that is humorless. They do not understand nuance. I'll give you an example. The film I just showed in Shanghai, which just opened, was actually banned by the Cultural Bureau. The way, it still got shown, the way we evaded the problem was actually to approach it in a way that because they completely lack humor. So they basically asked us for this, it's a 67-minute long film, and I was asked to basically provide, and it's shot in libraries, okay? So 67 minutes of books, all in Armenian, and we were asked to provide a title and synopsis and author bio for every single book. There are thousands of them. It's just not possible, and some of them are in a state of complete destruction. So, I don't know, this is live stream, I know, but I'm just going to say it anyway. I went online, I looked for a syllabus of Armenian poetry because no censor ever reads poetry, except to censor it. And I went and just downloaded this entire curricula and syllabi of Armenian poetry. Everything's already there. Like title, they can't read Armenian anyway, bam, that's it. This is one way to get bypass it. So I'm just saying there are strategies. We assume that a rule is unbreakable, but any rule or law that is unjust must be resisted and defied, right? So I think that to me, one of the best forms of resistance are the covert forms of resistance. You don't have to take it on head on. You can, and it's another way for you to also not feel helpless and powerless. We all have we have the possibility to do something with whatever meager power we may think we have, right? When you exercise that option of that so-called meager power, you realize you actually have way more than you thought you did. And there are always more of us than there are of them. I don't know if that answers your question, but frankly, I think that's okay.
It's fine. It's great to just take things where you need them to go. And another facet that I felt was quite key to bring forth here, especially for those who missed the last edition, is that it was incredible how many local younger practitioners from Kerala there were in this edition, and I do realize that that's also definitely work of the local team.
Yes.
To continue to nurture younger artists from Kerala, and also those who are senior artists but not shown enough, not exhibited enough, and that is extremely important work that seems to have been done on ground.
Yeah.
Could you share how you brought those perspectives into this Biennale, again without creating hierarchies between very renowned international artists and these local Kerala practitioners?
Well, one of the things that I asked for quite early on was an artist fee at parity for every artist, which was apparently not the norm. I think that was really important to do. So it didn't matter how important you were or how new you were to the scene, you all got the same amount. That was what I'd asked for. I know that it sounds like not much, but I can tell you as an artist, it's bloody important, okay? And it matters. It's essential very often. It makes all the difference to what you get to do next or what you're doing at that moment. And if you're already established and well known, you don't actually, it doesn't matter either way, right? I think that I tried really hard to look for artists who perhaps didn't have as much support, or say galleries and so on. Because of the pandemic, I wasn't able to complete my travel, because I left that bit to the end, to travel through Kerala and so on, and I couldn't do it. So I had to rely on recommendations, and I'll be very frank, the first set of recommendations I got didn't have a single woman. So I said, do we have anyone else? I'm sure non-men who also practice. in Kerala. But eventually it took a little time, because it's also not easy to just recommend people at the drop of a hat, right? But eventually, yes, I was lucky enough when I was able to go later in 2022 to actually meet some of these artists also. And it was important for me to again recognize the fact that, see, the Kochi Biennale is largely supported by the state government. But that is one pressure, yes, but I think it was very important for me to also remember the nature of the Biennale, which I experienced as an artist myself. Local people do have a sense of ownership over it, right? And that was very crucial. I know that they had been, I think Bose had done an exhibition of 100 Kerala artists already that year, or the previous year, I can't recall now. But still, the Kochi Biennale is the Kochi Biennale, right? And it was important to sort of look at artists who perhaps may not have been there. I mean, some were, but not all were. And yes, I did manage to show more than I'd hoped, which was brilliant. But to my mind, I think I would have probably done it quite differently. I would have actually traveled and done more on-site studio visits and things like that. That's something I really regret not being able to do. It makes a difference. It really, really makes a difference to meet artists in their own milieu. I think it's very important. Maria was able to go, which was great. I think you did, right? Did you meet Santi, or was it Bose who went? I can't recall.
We went out to the village to find that.
Yeah. And that's how we found the work of Santi, who's absolutely incredible. Santi Ian. And I think that's, eventually it comes together, right? I mean, you listen to people, you listen to what they're saying, listen to who they're meeting, and I still feel that, I mean, I'm open to criticism about this as well from people from Kerala, that it wasn't enough. I'm sure that criticism must be there. And I'm open to it because I feel it wasn't enough, given where it's situated, where the Biennale is situated. I mean, we had a larger number than the previous editions, but still, I feel it could have been more.
I'm sure there's lots of questions in the room.
Okay.
I have just one last question,
Sure.
if that's okay. I was also thinking very much about the way in which women artists were introduced with a kind of purposeful density, like Arpita Singh, like Home Vyarawala, and or artists such as Vivan being reintroduced, and reintroduced as in, again, it wasn't like a monumental install, but a very specific kind of work and a series of work that I've been also been very, very connected to. So yeah, maybe we could speak about that and then
sure. Thank you so much for bringing up Vivan's work. It was, as we all know, we lost a stalwart. He was. I'm just going to speak personally because I think that's the only way one should speak about a loss like this. You speak about what it means to you also personally. It was a great privilege to show his work, of course, in the Biennale. I think when I heard of his passing, I felt this horrible sense of. He was really actually the kindest person I knew in the Indian art world, and I never told him that. And I don't know if it would have made a difference either other way, but it's such an underrated quality to have. That compassion, that gentleness, it's just not there. People pride themselves on being blunt when they can't take it in turn, right? But they'll dish it out, but they can't take it. Vivan was the opposite of all of that. I mean, those of you who've had the luck to work with him know this as well. Like, he was just, anyway, I don't want to speak too much about how I personally feel about it, but I'm really happy we got to show some of his work that he did when he traveled to Latin America decades ago. Why is this important? Because as I mentioned earlier, when I was talking about teachers and the importance of people, their journeys over time, I think we have this tunnel vision. We always think that important things only happen in our time, to our generations, right? But South-South conversations have been happening for a very long time. And when I wanted to show the two series of work actually, I really wanted to show works from these two series in particular because it was important to show how conversations between the Spanish-speaking world and the Indian art world have been happening for a long time. It's not a new thing. Artists of my generation and younger are doing work inspired by Borges and so on. Amazing, great, we're all doing it, I love it. But conversations like this have been happening for a very long time. His portrait of Pablo Neruda, for instance, it's just, I think, such a beautiful, brilliant way to acknowledge that this is not you know, that we weren't closed off from each other. We've never been closed off from each other. Regime or not, it doesn't matter. We've always had this kind of osmosis or these conversations that diffuse across time and space. And I wanted to collapse that. And yes, because Vivan is such a towering figure, it would have been very tempting to show something monumental, but I was very clear that I wouldn't. That I would show these drawings, and that these really very light, almost delicate works that actually cross time so beautifully and space so beautifully and brilliantly. Yeah.
Do you want to speak to the other part?
Well, I forgot the other part.
Of women artists like Arpita Singh and Homai Vyarawala.
Thank you. I really liked Homai Vyarawala's the series that we chose because it's the women's college. Again, like I mentioned, what it means to be, you know, what it means to actually be privileged enough to get, to be educated, to get access to certain types of skill or vocation or so on. I think this is one of the things we underrate so much, right? The influence of people older than you and what they can do in that respect. I think that was really important. It was in proximity with Arpita's work, if you recall, right? It was, that was all quite deliberate, those proximities. I think I did also very much want to have certain dissonances, but in some places it was important to show that solidarity exists over time, that sisterhood exists over time. I love what Natalie spoke about, female solidarity over generations. Love that because it's so true. In the absence of, when you don't see women at all in your textbooks and you don't see any transgenerational female or non-male, non-conventional male narratives being passed on. I mean, how do you create this? And I realized this fairly recently only when I was interviewing someone and they said, use the word foremother in a way that was very casual, and I realized she didn't say forefather. And I realized that we almost always foreground the man or the masculine ideal of knowledge transmission, right? In that room, it was very clear in all these proximities of the knowledge transmission that was occurring, whether it was in the college, whether it was through Arpita's work, which is also a form of knowledge transmission in its most brilliant, beautiful, and also brutal form, right? All of that knowledge transmission was very present in her paintings. And I think that those proximities were also there because we had other artists, also two artists from Kerala in the same room, and then you had, I mean, I think this was very deliberate. This was, I wanted people to feel this without being told what they're looking at. Thank you.
Thank you. Taking questions, thoughts, other forms of expression.
Thank you very much for your presentation. My question might seem a bit circuitous, and I think you have already answered it in parts. But when you say storytelling and song is strategy, storytelling and songs are also so much about history, so much about what has passed. And I'm curious to know, mostly also in reference to the art world, what do you think the commons are, one? I know, I mean, I'm just asking what your vision of it is. And secondly, what is the strategy? And I think you have talked about it, but what are the strategies to make it more robust?
Okay.
I see that, you know, because you work with books, you work with languages, but there's also the doing. And how do we make this, this common slightly wider?
Yeah. Thank you. Love the question. Thank you so much. And why do I love this question? Simply because the commons, as for those of you who know, the history of the commons actually, it's a word from England, and it referred to the fact that the public commons were very often large green open spaces. And people could just, working class people, anyone, peasants, anyone could use these spaces. The biggest act of destruction that England did to itself, apart from the shit it did all over the world, was to actually, the Enclosures Act, which was basically meant that they fenced off all this land and it came under private ownership, and their wealthy landowners basically, people weren't allowed to use this land anymore. Even recently, I think this year, there was a big battle with one wealthy man trying to make sure no one could even cross the land as they had crossed it for centuries on their walks or whatever. So the right to camp, the right to inhabit, the right to walk, all these are very natural human things. And not only human, other species migrate, they travel, they have, you know, between territories. We are constantly fencing off land. So the destruction of the commons is not only the neoliberal takeover of public land and turning from a public good, it's turned into a private profit-making engine, right? I mean, and that's the whole point of, we see this with that's why I work with libraries, because libraries are one of the last few public commons, so to speak. But I was just thinking, and I think this is quite common amongst people who have the same preoccupations. It's important to talk about the commons not only as a knowledge commons, because that can exist online. I don't think it's enough to exist online, and this was cemented even more so during the pandemic. If the online world was enough, we would have all been okay. None of us came out of the pandemic okay. Let's just admit this right there. There's an acute sense of what the social isolation does, even to introverts, and I'm an introvert, so I can tell you this, is it diminished our ability to appreciate humanity for all its flaws and its miasma. We just became even more intolerant of certain things. And I think that level of intolerance was built up by our migrating ourselves almost completely online. So I believe in the commons as physical territory. I advocate for the commons as physical territory. I imagine the Biennale as a territory, as I mentioned earlier, that people could inhabit and feel a right to. Again, idealistic, whether it worked or not is not for me to say, honestly. It's for people to know what they felt. They won't come and tell me, oh, I felt it was a commons. It doesn't make sense, obviously. I don't expect people to think that way, but I hoped it might be. And I hope more than anything else that by inhabiting that space and being irreverent around the works, just people just people being in a kind of casual proximity, very comfortable proximity, understanding that you can have multiple ideas in the same space that you're inhabiting. You don't have to agree with those ideas, because that's the nature of a Biennale, right? There are things you won't like, and there are things you won't agree with. Make space for that. Make space for those disagreements. And that's why I don't generally have patience for people who are very dismissive and make value judgments about artwork or text or writing or literature or whatever, or film, especially film. People are like, yeah, but I don't like close-ups because they, it's kind of telling the audience what to look at. So that doesn't mean the film has no value. Yeah, critics do think like this sometimes, and even a lot of people are dismissive about certain works. I've heard this in the art world a lot, where people dismiss artwork because they're only looking at the image of it. They're not actually looking at where it's located, what it's done, even the process that's behind it. Ultimately, a Biennale, like any exhibition, removes original context. We don't see the method, we don't see the process, speaking as an artist right now. You don't see what the artist even thought of. We see the end result, the product. We see the product in the Biennale or the exhibition, right? So the Biennale's commons is a flawed idea. It's not a perfect idea, but still is territory. And it's a territory where failures can be allowed to happen, because that's the nature of a public space. It's not adjudicated that everything must be perfect product. Then we're talking about a mall, right? I wanted to negate those things. I wanted to negate that awful shiny veneer of perfectionism that we're so wedded to under capitalism. And I mean, I live in Singapore, which is a hyper-urban mall. So I mean, I had that also, that notion. I think it's important to have that kind of those dissonances present, basically, and that to me is the commons.
Shubigi,
yeah,
shall we take more questions?
Yeah, sure.
Just so that maybe more than one at a time. Yeah. So we're going to take 2 questions, and then you can.
Sure.
Anyone else? Yeah.
Thank you for your presentation. As someone who has not been to the Biennale, it was really very interesting. As you said, and we know that the Kochi Biennale is supported by the state government. So you talked extensively about the limitations of the pandemic, what you could not do because of the pandemic. So does the state government sponsoring this kind of an event put limitations on the way the style of functioning or the way you curate? Would it have been different if it was not the state government?
Most Biennales have external support, right? And if there were limitations, I'll be very honest, I just ignored everything. I knew the artists I wanted, and that was it. I'm very glad to say that I was able to concentrate on just that. Like, it was important for me to, if there were pressures, I could just pretend that they didn't exist. Like I said, you ignore that heavy hand. You don't allow it to move you around, to manipulate you into making choices that you would not be able to live with.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other thoughts, comments from anyone? Okay. All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.